Welcome to On Par, the podcast all about public administration that is based on work published in Public Administration Review. I'm Katherine Willoughby, co-editor-in-chief of the journal with Raadschelders. Together with our team, editor Hongtao and management analyst Preston Phillips, through the journal, this podcast, and other affiliated outlets, we want to bring you the latest information about developments in governments around the world, advancements in theory and conceptual knowledge about governance and government, and to connect and inform practitioners and academic communities globally. Our first issue of PAR is out. You can find it at the journal website, accessible through Wiley. And today we interview two scholars that are published in our early career intel section of the journal. In this section, we include compelling and novel work of those new to the academy, those studying for a doctoral degree, working in a postdoc position, or as an assistant professor. Our guests today are Karen Sweeting and Brie Haupt. These professors will talk about their recently published research in PAR, Overcoming Neutrality as an Organizational Learning Impediment. Karen, you're an assistant professor at the University of Rhode Island, and Brie, you are an assistant professor at Virginia Commonwealth University. Please tell us a little bit more about yourselves, including a fun fact. Let's start with Karen.
Okay, so prior to my academic tenure, I spent over 20 years in public service, and my background is primarily in human resource management. I am also an immigrant, so I also draw from a body of international experience, and I sort of bring that insight from my practitioner experience into my research. A fun fact about me, I don't know, I like Marvel movies. I like action movies. I like to see things moving, and I like to see
action. Action.
You like to see action versus inaction, Karen.
Yes.
That's great. Thank you, Karen. Good. Brie?
Yes. Thank you again for this opportunity to speak with you all. So yes, I am Dr. Brie Haupt. I am in the Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness at Virginia Commonwealth University. And my focus, I think my entire life has been, how do we communicate with people? I find that during crises, especially, and during emergencies and disasters, we're always forgetting someone, or we don't know how to talk to people or how to be spoken with. How do we craft our messages? How do we make sure that everybody has that goal, and then at least there's someone there who can acknowledge that someone's missing? And how can we make sure to increase the resilience capacity for our communities and just continue to humanize people? I think we dehumanize them enough by using numbers and values versus stories and narratives. About me, actually, my first publication ever was a book review in PAR. So yay, thank you guys for getting me started.
That's fantastic. That's a great fun fact.
Yeah.
Thank you. Action and already published. So there we go. All right. Well, we'll move on to the questions. Specifically in your article, you state that neutrality as practiced and studied in public administration remains a mechanism that crushes humanity. Can you explain this for us, Brie?
So for me, this idea of being neutral is something that we just can never be. As we grow up and as we are socialized within our communities and the people we interact with, there's always something of value that we give towards everything that we perceive. And this idea of being neutral, that we can somehow take our emotions away from it, our experiences away from it, that we can look at every single person and understand all of their needs somehow, or that every single person is meant to adapt to our needs as a society, whatever society that is. I feel like that's why it crushes humanity, because it continues to see people as being value neutral, or as trying to be, or it's forcing people to adapt to a society that's trying to be quote unquote neutral, but obviously fails because we have so many discriminatory practices. We have so many people who aren't getting their even basic needs met. And so again, I feel like we're making people conform to what we as a society may think is positive or neutral, versus having people kind of show us what they think.
Erin, do you have anything to add to that?
I agree completely, because in our article, and our article is titled Overcoming Neutrality as an Organizational Learning Impediment, we introduce the veil of neutrality, because what a veil does is it blurs and it obscures. And in this context, we indicate that it creates a sense of detachment from the negative implications and outcomes of treating everyone the same, because we're not all the same, right? And this idea of impartiality and indifference is problematic in public service. Within that same vein, it's also important to clarify that perspectives on neutrality will vary, right? And the impact of neutrality will depend on the specific context. In our article, we focus on issues of equity, justice, and situations where there's systematic oppression or discrimination, to convey that being neutral can be interpreted as tacit support for the status quo, right? And we don't always consider the dignity of humanness when we serve people. So essentially, when neutrality is practiced, it hinders our advancement of equity, inclusion, and justice, because it fails to consider individualized needs and circumstances. We attempted to articulate, and we hope we were able to convey, that we all have a role and we all have a responsibility in ridding public service of this neutral orthodoxy, right? We must get back to serving people and recognizing that we're not all the same, as I said before, and we don't all have the same needs. And there's an article that we reference in our research from Mastracci and Sementelli that was written in 2021. And they wrote that we can no longer afford to be neutrally neutered public service since we engage people. And I latched onto this idea of being a neutered public service because we're enculturated and socialized to operate in mechanized ways, right? And in engaging people, we're bounded within certain systems that seeks to bind us in place. And another thing that we articulated in our article is that we need to be bold and brave enough to stop and question, why are we doing things the way we're doing them? What are the underlying driving forces that continue to generate disparities in practice? And what can we do differently? I think that was a mouthful.
No, to build off of that, Karen, too, when we think about how societies are developed, it's always, I always say the winners write history. We always see society from the vantage point of the people who have the ability to write what they see, and then for those that believe that that is that truth. So even this idea of neutrality and being objective in public administration started from earlier public administrators who were of a certain class, certain gender, certain race, and they created what we consider even neutrality. So when Karen's talking about we need to question, whenever I hear in an environment that, oh, this is always how we do it, but why? Why? What's the reason behind why we're doing this? And if no one can answer the question, then I'm curious, where did it come from? And why do we implement it?
That's interesting, and it leads to our second question about cultural competence, which is such a powerful concept. And it does seem like a natural evolutionary step for successful public organizations to develop and maintain, especially today. And why, following COVID and the Black Lives Matter movement and other events, does it seem to remain so elusive for many governments, certainly in the United States, to achieve some sort of cultural competence to advance?
That is such a deep question. It seems natural. However, you're also hinging on the people who are implementing for them to, for some, it's buying into the fact that cultural competence is even a concept. To even the fact that social equity right now is being targeted all the time, and this idea of like, everyone is equal. I've heard that actually from some of my students, that of course everyone's equal, and I'm like, okay, well, let's think about a specific situation.
But that's just one definition of equity. That's just one definition.
It is. So this idea, that we have cultural competence acknowledges the fact that we are not equal, that there are discrepancies, there are things that we should take into consideration. Even there's that lawsuit with Texas and the American with Disabilities Act about not having polling locations that were accessible by individuals with mobility issues, with blind or low limited vision, or deaf or hard of hearing. So you're already taking people out of even just the political process within that, with this idea of like, oh, well, we assume that even if you have these issues, we assume that you have the ability to overcome those issues or challenges or differences, and that you're able to get to some of these locations, that you're able to understand the administrative system, able to interact with it.
Karen.
So it's interesting because, again, I agree with Brie, because the problem remains, though, is there are a lot of problems that remain, right? There's the complex interplay between historical and socio-political factors that continue to pose challenges to development of cultural competence. Neutrality, for example, is one of those deeply entrenched systems in bureaucracy, and it is normalized, and it is rationalized, and it is sustained. And as I mentioned earlier, we're socialized to approach challenges because we're technical experts focusing on identifying the optimal solutions, right? Because we're always, as public servants, we're always in motion, right? We're always acting and trying to move on to the next challenge. And oftentimes, I think about it from so many different lenses, and my mind is putting all of them together at the moment. So let me pause for a moment, right? A straightforward answer, let's go there, could be also that organizations do not know where to start or how to start, right? And this is, we introduced a framework that we thought would be helpful to provide steps to guide organizations in engaging these issues. A challenge, though, for that, though, is access to academic work for practitioners. There's still this line between practice and academia, and we have to figure out the work that we're doing in academia, how can we make that more readily accessible to practitioners and not have it locked behind paywalls, right? Another factor is fear. Fear is a resonant factor that can be debilitating to change. Other factors could also include the overwhelming nature of overhauling a system, ensuring that there is a continual and sustainable investment of resources. And when I say resources, I'm talking about people, time, and money, right? And an even more critical factor is when I was first introduced to the idea of cultural competence, I really grappled with it in terms of what does this mean? And when you talk to people, people actually think this means that you have to know everything about every culture in order to be culturally competent.
Not at all, not at all.
And as practitioners, and as a former practitioner myself, I still consider myself a practitioner, we don't always know how to communicate across differences, right? And when we engage those that are labeled different, how we convey certain things and how they interpret meaning from that is what continues to pose us a challenge for us. And it requires careful consideration and thoughtful reflection. And sometimes, as I said before, as practitioners, we don't time to reflect, because we're always moving and doing. And although cultural competence is a powerful concept, I can't even speak, it's too early, right? We also articulate in the article that scholars have also critiqued cultural competence, the entrenched institutional structures, systemic barriers, resistance to change, and it often lacks a clear path towards its development. So in our article, I know we introduced 8 types of initiatives, and one of them is leadership and setting the tone from the top. But leadership alone is not sufficient, right? And this is why there are 8 of them, because each builds on the next, and it's just figuring out, okay, where do I get started? And just accounting for how you navigate the systemic issues and structural power balances that remain in place. So
yeah, I mean, again, this is we're kind of dealing with this in a cascading way, because that does lead us to the next question, digging into advancing cultural competence. I noted to y'all earlier that social equity and human rights budgeting has been at the forefront of reforms by governments for decades. And in fact, in Australia, the Women's Budget Statement, in the recent one, indicates women's equality is at the heart of what we do as government. It is essential for strengthening our economy, our society, and our nation. And you talk about de-biasing documents, which is I think in today's world where we think about the generation, AI generation of papers and ideas, and it being very, white male centric in providing examples, how do we move forward in organizations to de-bias documents, hundreds of documents, given that, as you note, public servants are always in action?
Yeah. I mean, for me, it's the start of just asking the question, do we even need to? Because I think even that, thank you, Karen, for your support right there. But I think even this idea of, people interpret everything differently. Even from the work we did in our article, we changed verbiage of this concept instead of an organizational learning disability, because the connotation from my perspective and from my work is that disability means that you are less than because you have something different. And it puts it's an impediment. It's not necessarily a disability in terms of negativity that you cannot overcome, so even these ideas of the words have meaning to different people. And if you put a policy in front of even just your employees, how many of them will interpret differently based on words alone? So we're going to look at de-biasing. We really need to look at the impact of our policies versus the intent behind them, because I think that's where we get lost in translation. It's just everyone is going to look at things from their own viewpoint. They have their own connections with different words and concepts. Even the term citizen is so exclusionary because not everyone, at least in the United States, not everyone is considered an American citizen. That doesn't mean that they're not members of our community and that there's not individuals that we need to take into account when creating policies, when looking at, for me, from looking at emergency management response and preparation and looking at these different things, just because that term citizen, and for some people, that term citizen is so negative because it's something they'll never get.
Interesting. Karen.
So your question is, what makes this initiative seem so hard to do effectively in U.S. government? To Brie's point, language matters, right? And who's doing the de-biasing matters.
Yes.
So when we talk about public service, we're talking about budget, right? We're talking about constraints. We're talking about competing priorities, and we're also talking about the pressure to demonstrate results. And because we're looking for tangible outcomes, de-biasing documents doesn't always generate such outcomes. So to Brie's point, again, when we look at de-biasing initiatives, it's about how things are tailored, how they're written, and how they're interpreted. And as I said before, who is doing the debiasing?
Right.
It requires a diverse body, as documents require a nuanced understanding, right, of the diverse and multicultural that we live in, such as the United States. So additionally, we're also figuring out structural, cultural, political factors. And we see now certain rhetorics, right, that are framed certain way to convey certain messaging. And I'm struggling to put this all together, right? Because efforts to debias documents may encounter resistance or skepticism because, again, to Brie's point, we don't all operate from the same understanding, but that's what's so unique about this idea. We need to come together, right? And there are some words that are just, I'm teaching a class now on DEI. And one of the things that I introduce to my students is we enter a room and we say, hey guys, right? Did you stop to think for a moment that guys is a gendered term and not everyone showing up in this space wants to be referred to as guys, right? So how do we take a step back and say, hi everyone, it's just a simple change in word, right? And that's sort of, we have normalized a certain language and we use them without thinking of what those implications are for anyone who may not agree with the use of these terminologies. And sometimes it's just an awareness that that words have different meanings to different groups, you know, and just taking a step back and sort of bringing in different voices, bringing in different perspectives, and say, how can we say this in a way where we get to a wider audience without alienating any group of people?
Right. I'm going to move to the next question so we get through all these good ideas. In some ways, you seem to call on public servants to serve in advocacy roles, reflective of lobbyists or even interest groups, or even as elected officials. Is this a fair assessment? And if so, would unelected administrators taking on such roles threaten accountability or democratic governance in any way?
To me, I'm just going to intersect a little bit here because I still have thoughts from the last kind of coming in together. It's almost like that understanding of cultural competence. You know, from my point of view, cultural competence is acquiring the knowledge, skills, and abilities to be able to understand and communicate more effectively with different communities. And these communities can vary, you know, so it doesn't have to be just race-based, which I feel like a lot of our initiatives and a lot of what public servant, when we think of trying to neutralize things or trying to be, you know, operating DEI, so diversity, equity, and inclusive, they always seem to go for the top things in diversity, which is usually like race, socioeconomic status, those types of things, and we need to look past just that, and so by having individuals, public servants take on an advocacy role, the term advocacy even needs to be looked at. Advocacy doesn't mean that you have to be the person that's in the trench with signs or who's in front of your elected officials or unelected officials pushing for the change. Advocacy can also take place behind the scenes in a way. It can take place by questioning the impact of a specific policy or procedure, by recommending having spaces where people can dialogue about these in what we can at least try to make as safe environments where every single view is respected, that we try to understand. I always say you got to love people. You have to listen, you have to understand, you have to validate. And so by having people in a room that can talk about these different aspects and what kind of advocacy they can do with budget or no budget, because we all know budget's always a problem, and people who put the money, they're being led by the person who either believes in these initiatives or doesn't. So you can't always rely on the budget to help you with these initiatives, you know, but
probably incorporating what you're saying, we would move from saying advocacy to navigation. We can talk about public servants and navigating, you know, a more inclusive environment for all.
Yeah.
And I think what you talk about in terms of the word that we use in these initiatives is very, very important.
Yeah.
So thank you.
I also think, oh, sorry, I'm going to just really quickly. I also
Yeah.
think advocacy starts with self-reflection. I think for you, you need to look at yourself and say, who am I? You know, when we are socialized, I feel like it's human nature to, if we want to be comfortable with something, we have to define it. We have to put it in boxes and compartmentalize, and we have to have it make sense to us. But how we view things is going to be different. And so if we can understand how we view the world, the lens that we look through, and the identities we have that alter that lens or that color that lens in different ways, then I think we can start having more fruitful conversation, because we can come to the table saying, this is how I view it because of this part of my past.
And that's
I
what
think that's a
Preston
great
has.
way to think about it. And also, I think, self-reflection is vital,
Mhm.
and probably asking folks to take themselves back to getting into public service in the first place, because most people, when you ask them about getting into public service, they always say, I want to help people.
Yeah.
So that sort of self-reflection, to go back to why is it that I first got involved, to make a difference, to influence and help people, then that can help you in generating this idea of cultural competency.
I sort of have a
Yes, Karen.
different lens on this, right? Not completely different, but a little bit of a different thought. And my first point is, I don't think we need to look past race and socioeconomic status.
Oh, no, not at
Rather,
all.
I think what we need to do is broaden our purview
Yes.
to be more inclusive of other markers that are minoritized and marginalized. The point that I'm really that I really want to make here is that public practitioners are often spread thin, right? The demanding nature of their jobs, combined with a lack of resources, emotional stress, staffing shortages, heavy workload, routinized behavior and responses, and just limited access to a host of resources to help us do and work better, is problematic, right? We are often mechanized to operate in certain ways, and this impedes our development of cultural competence, right? So while the suggestions in our article may encourage public servants to engage in advocacy roles, it's important to note that the intent is not necessarily to equate them with lobbyists, interest group, or elected officials, because as public administrators, we advocate for policies and practices that align with public interest, right? And our focus is on advancing and improving equitable outcomes within the scope of our responsibilities. And a lot of that has to do with our individualized roles within public service, because where we stand in our organizations will determine how far our reach can go in supporting some of these efforts. I just wanted to add that into the conversation. Like, it's being conscientious of who the people that are serving people, right? We're all human beings. And it's funny that Brie said we have to love people. I don't think you have to love people. Right? I think you have to recognize that we're all human beings, and people seeking service from government, generally those most in need, right? So we have to respect the dignity of the people that we're serving. And that requires us sometimes to challenge the systems in which we're operating in.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Background
I think we've got one more question to wrap this up. So can you provide us with examples of successful public agencies or governments that have overcome neutrality, realized some sort of cultural proficiency, and can serve as touchstones for others?
I can kick this one off. And I would say it's challenging to point to specific examples of government or public agencies that have completely overcome neutrality, because the concept of neutrality is ingrained in governance structures. However, in my research, I have seen government entities such as DOE, USDA, and VA, institute measures to navigate some of these challenges effectively. Also seen, though, is how a change in leadership can disrupt the progress made in these efforts. So it's tied to who's setting the tone from the top and the continual investment to sustain progress made, right? I say we sort of see things going up and down, right? We're advancing efforts and then we shift and then we regress. And in our current political climate, and if we calibrate where we are right now, right, we see a lot of illiberal movement, sensationalism on social media platforms that are targeting DEI and that are disrupting what's been put in place over the past few years. And DEI, and people are latching on to DEI now as a divisive concept. And when we look at our political arena, we know the next election is going to be critical in terms of how we move forward with public service. And just recognizing that people continue to experience disparities based on the systems and structures in place, right? So how do we continue in our advocacy, right, and go up against the rhetoric that's out there and challenge this legacy of discrimination that's rooted in the fabric of public systems? It's hard to say that we need to continue the fight, because part of the problem is people get tired, right? And
Brie, we'll give Brie a chance for her last comments.
I agree, Karen. We can get drained for sure. I go back to where it's also, I can't pinpoint, but I love to promote the changes that are happening that are positively impacting these marginalized communities and these underserved communities from the emergency management standpoint. For instance, I mean, for me, criticism, it took till 2021 for this to happen, but the Federal Emergency Management Agency, when you're applying for aid after a crisis and you have to prove home ownership, that's difficult for some people to prove because they may not have a deed, multi-generational house. And we were seeing this with people with in Katrina, trying to apply for aid, but they couldn't provide any of the documents to show home ownership. So they couldn't get the money from FEMA just for one little aspect. And let's not even go about the fact that we're expecting people to understand the aid system and to comprehend the language and understand the documents and being able to do the time invested in that. That's a whole nother aspect. But the fact that they're finally at least looking at some of these policies to see why are certain people not getting the aid they need. And
it's a great example.
Yeah, that's one change opens things up.
Yeah. Yep, that's a great point. And we're going to leave it there. So thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you both for this enlightening conversation and for your important contribution to PAR. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
And thank you to our listeners. We look forward to the next time when we will continue to examine the intersection of theory and practice of public administration. Please let us know how we're doing. You can email us at par.editors@gmail.com and find us on Spotify, X, and LinkedIn and other social media. On Par is made possible by ASPA and our editorial team, with special thanks for podcast production to Jessica Rao, our PAR editorial assistant. And with that, we say goodbye.